I have the pleasure of introducing the panel. This session is being moderated by Jennifer Ditchburn. She'll be joined by Paulette Senior, Sylvia Maracle, and Faye Faraday. Jennifer is the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, the influential digital magazine of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. An award-winning journalist, Jennifer previously worked as a parliamentary correspondent for the Canadian Press and for the CBC. We have Paulette Senior, who is president and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. Paulette has devoted her career to empowering women and girls to overcome barriers and reach their full potential. Paulette started her career on the front lines of social service organizations in some of Toronto's most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. She saw how social resources and systemic change could transform women's lives. We have Sylvia Maracle. Sylvia Maracle is Mohawk from the Tyendinaga, Mohawk territory, and is a member of the Wolf Clan. Sylvia is the executive director of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres and has been involved in the Friendship Centre movement for more than 40 years. A passionate advocate, she is known for her leadership in the area of ending violence against Indigenous women, justice, education, housing, poverty, and cultural-based management. Faye Faraday is a social justice lawyer, strategic advisor, and policy consultant at Faraday Law, whose work focuses on constitutional law, human rights, and labor law. Faye supports social justice movement building. She works collaboratively with community-based organizations and multi-stakeholder coalitions to develop strategic visions to advance human rights and social justice. She is the co-chair of the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Is this working? Yes. Thank you, Lois, for those kind opening remarks, and I'll just wait for everybody to get installed. So how many of you have read the new report from the ONN on women's voices? It's pretty amazing. I want to salute Pamela Uppel for all her work on this project for Decent Work for Women. It's really, I think, important. One thing that struck me about the Women's Voices report is how amazing it is to actually talk to women that are working at the grassroots level and quoting them and getting their perspective on what it's like to work in the sector. Just a bit of background on myself. I work for a not-for-profit think tank, and I was the first woman when I was hired to be the editor-in-chief of Policy Options 2.5 years ago. I was the first woman in 35 years to be at the helm of the magazine. And so in the media sector, we are also quite well acquainted with the problems, the gender gap in leadership positions, and also just with the pay gap as well. So I thought we would start off by first getting a bit of a lay of the land from our esteemed panelists. And one thing that came out of the report, I think the Women's Voices report, was the sense that it's because the sector is women-dominated that's why it's underpaid and undervalued and sometimes just plain old unrecognized. So maybe Paulette, I'll start with you. What do you think is that your assessment as well for why we see these disparities within the sector?
Thank you, Jennifer. I don't think anyone would be surprised to say absolutely that is my assessment. You know, it's not a surprise to know that wherever women are taking care of others, so that particular sector or job or focus becomes less valued, and that less valuing is actually demonstrated by the pay. The pay is one aspect and probably one of the most important aspects, but certainly it is. And I think it's reflective of issues around gender equality, which is a focus of the Canadian Women's Foundation, that women are paid less, and even more disturbing, I find, even in a sector where it's 80% dominated by women, that when men are leading in the sector, when there are ED, CEOs, or other executive positions, that they are paid more comparatively to women who are leading. So it is systemic, and we have a problem in our sector that is no different from the problem we have generally in society.
Sylvia, if you give us an overview based on your time working in the sector, which is a very long time, do you feel that it's because there's so many women in the sector that's what makes it undervalued and underpaid?
Well, I agree with the findings. I think the issue for us as Indigenous women is that there have been a number of society changes for us and that have impacted on sort of where we have arrived in participating in any economies. I think as well that the issue for us has been legislative. If you recall, until very few years ago, the civilizing process in this country intended to take our status away, and the consequence of that was not being able to live in your home territories and not to have recognition. So I think in our community, we sort of turned to the whole nonprofit sector because there was nowhere else for us. And where I work at the Federation, it'll be 50 years old next year, it actually only has 4 executive directors, so 3 men and me, and we'll see what happens as a consequence of that. But I can tell you from friends and colleagues I've in the room, we've actually made enormous shifts in the last decade or two through the work we do with nonprofits about creating leadership roles for ourselves in some respect and for other women. But I agree, it isn't honored, it's not recognized, it's not well-resourced, and we're subject to the whim of government policy frequently. And that doesn't mean it's a good thing they want us to hurry up and do more than we're doing or sit and wait. So I'm there. I can also tell you that no matter how poorly paid women in this room are, our women make 77% on average in this country of the wage that you bring. So it is something as people who deliver nonprofits that we really need to address.
So you raise an interesting point, which is, yes, there's a gender pay gap nationally, but within the sector it's worse than, if I'm reading the data properly, it's worse than the national pay gap. So Faye, what is at the root of that, do you think? And I want to note that you're on the co-chair of the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition, so.
Yeah, and so this is something that we've been focusing on for decades. I do want to pick up on what Sylvia was saying about who bears the brunt of the gender pay gap. It is Indigenous women, it is racialized women, it is women who are immigrants, who are racialized immigrants, and women with disabilities who bear the largest brunt of that pay gap. I just want to put some figures on that so we know what we're talking about. For women with disabilities across Canada, their gender pay gap is 46%. For Indigenous women, it's 45%. For racialized women, it's around 40%. And you can see that even though we generally talk about the pay gap being 32% and having been steady at that for decades, who really bears that are racialized and Indigenous and women with disabilities. And these are the women who are also predominating in the nonprofit sector. The pay gap is particularly deep in the nonprofit sector for a number of reasons. One is that the work is highly feminized, and research over many decades has demonstrated that the more feminized work is, the more that work is associated with women, the deeper the discrimination that they face in the wages. And you see that reflected in the comments in the Women's Voices report, where women talk about not having their professional skills recognized as skills that are compensated. And that is something that is common throughout the sector. But another driver is the history of the development of the sector, where it hasn't really been treated as the real economy. The kind of services and supports that are provided in the sector are also predominantly provided to women, to children, to people who are elderly, to people who are recent immigrants. It's a sector that emerged from a charitable perspective, where it was seen as volunteer work that wealthy women did to help other people. And the more that caregiving work is seen as women's work, it's seen as something that's just part of being a woman, what you give to the community, not the real part of the economy. But everything that you do makes all the rest of the economy possible. Without the work that you do, the entire economy collapses. And yet there's that mentality that they are different things. So when we talk about the care penalty, it is that notion that you're working in a sector that is about caring for others, and so you should be happy with the warm fuzzies, right? One of the voices in the report said, yeah, we get paid in warm fuzzies, but warm fuzzies don't put food on the table, right? And that's what's happening throughout the sector.
Paula, do you see that care penalty as well manifesting itself in the organizations that you work for?
I was thinking about an experience I had a few years ago, where an organization that I worked with had a labor dispute, and so the staff were locked out. And I came in to help to reestablish the organization and put things straight as they were. And I remember someone in the community saying, now this is an organization that does extraordinarily good work within the violence against women sector. And I heard someone say, but I thought they were all volunteers. Why are they striking? And I was really taken aback by that comment, because even though the community in general was most generous to this organization, there wasn't a really solid understanding that this was work and that people actually had to have credentials to do the work. And so it was just assumed that, since they're taking care, what are they striking about? This is coming from the heart. So there is less value that's placed on those of us who use our hearts in our work. And that is, we're living in a society where that is kind of crazy, where if you are taking care of people who are the most treasured resource, then it's seen as less valuable. But if you are, and no disrespect to those who are doing that, but if you are drilling oil, then that is seen as most valuable based on how it's seen in society. So I think we have a problem in terms of things being turned upside down in terms of how we view it. And the sector is extraordinarily vulnerable and could be easily picked off by a legislative change. We had a federal government in the previous establishment that was not supportive of the women's sector and not particularly supportive of gender equality work. And we could see that because organizations were defunded right across the country, and that's particularly nationally. And so, any sort of pulling of a rung could actually really devastate particular aspects of our sector. So not only are we underpaid and undervalued, but we're also really vulnerable to any sort of legislative change. And we could see some of that happening in Ontario.
So what I'm hearing here seems to be about external reaction to the sector But I'm curious, as someone that doesn't necessarily work amongst you every day, what's happening inside the sector that people are undervaluing the women in the sector? So you're talking about government and so on, but what's creating the gap inside it? Is that sort of an absorption of the overall attitude towards nonprofit work? Sylvia.
I think it's a little bit of catch-up. I think that, I mean, certainly if I take, again, a perspective of Indigenous women, and I look at what the actual conscious dismantling of our entire social structure, so that Indigenous women were going to be at the end. So in the last few years, we've been arguing over matrimonial property. I mean, if you're First Nations or you live in your community, you have not had rights in a divorce or custody, really, because you don't have a house, so you're homeless. What's going to happen? You know, people were engaged, and so I think for us, it is about a recovery of us, and so I'm not sure that we're undermining what we do. I think we kind of came late to the party of expressing our own self-determination, our own recognition, and that meant that we had legislative fights, you know, to be treated equally, to basic human rights that other women in this had before we had them, to look at issues of childcare for a very long time. It was a state process in this country that we couldn't raise our own kids. That's called residential school. We couldn't care for our own seniors. It goes on and on. So I think for us it was the Quebec Native women had a campaign once, they called it Rêve-toi, wake up. And that's what we were doing. I think we're now doing it, and I think that Indigenous women are leading much of the change that's occurring in our community. And you're going to see more and more increases of that as we begin to look at our own self-determined ways about what's important to our community. And quite frankly, despite whether it's the Blackfoot or Maslow, it's still about water, food, shelter, and clothing first. And then we can go on to safety and security. And for us, you only need to read the paper every day to see it continues to not be safe in Canada, also, by the way, in the US and Mexico, for Indigenous women. The kind of sexualization that occurred, that it's okay to treat us that way. There are a whole bunch of issues for us. So we've created nonprofits, and we're mandating ourselves, and we're starting to pay ourselves well, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. So get on the train.
Maybe I'll pick up on, you were talking about the importance of food, shelter, safety, and so on. You're also talking about legislation and the Indian Act, which has been on the books since 1876. What impact does that legislation continue to have? Or is it possible for women living, let's talk about women living on reserve, to explore self-determination without dismantling that act first? I know this is a huge question, but I'll put it to you.
In a minute. Okay.
More than a minute.
So remember, I work in urban areas, and I work in urban areas for a reason, because I don't want to live there. and I do want to be able to express myself, and I made those determinations. But the thing about the Indian Act is it has created administrative structures, which used to be called reserves. They had an Indian agent. They now have an elected council, and of course they've used the new language of First Nations. But they continue to be administrative structures of the federal government. And there's a process by which you go and consult that has been formalized somewhat in law, where you have to go speak to chief and council. But you know, less than 12% of the 633, 34 First Nations in this country, communities, are led by women. And so it means that you don't actually have to talk to women in a consultative process that's actually mandated by law. And so women are not always being engaged. And and women often sacrifice themselves for greater good and how we're going to take care of community. And so the resourcing issue becomes difficult. So I think that the role, for instance, that Native women's groups play and collections of service providers play is trying to make the space where women in the community can articulate. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things that's left over from the Indian Act is that people, and the press does this very well, believes that everybody's talking to us, but in fact women are not primarily engaged in those discussions, and they need to be. I was trying to do some quick statistical reviews. In terms of nonprofits, I think in our community, we're probably closer to 90% women. And in our organization, over a long period of time, we've consciously attempted to change the leadership so that, 28 Friendship Center executive directors, 21 of them are women. Of 28 presidents of boards, 18 are women. We're moving the yardstick and trying to make that space and mentor and have the conversation. But we also reach out to our sister organizations and to other organizations, and we try to hold them accountable for what are they doing. So.
Thank you. Paulette, help us understand the reality of racialized women in the nonprofit sector. Mm-hmm. What kind of challenges do women in the sector face particularly? We've heard a little bit about Indigenous women and some of the challenges related to ongoing colonialization, but based on your expertise and your history in the sector.
I'll do that, and I want to pick up from the previous conversation, which is what are some of the internal reasons. One of the things that I'm struck by is that for many of us in the nonprofit sector, depending on the issue you're working in, it started from a movement. So when I think of the violence against women sector, or the shelter systems that we've now created and work in, they started from a few women sitting around a table and deciding that we have to keep women safe, and then acting to do that. And then it grew into what we now have and the sector that we're all working in. So perhaps there's something there to look at in terms of a development of the sector, that we have to now demand that our sector be respected, and that without the sector, what would society be? Because the sector is now a key player in the economy, as Faye was saying earlier. And because of that, we need to utilize that power in more effective ways in terms of addressing some of the issues that we're seeing. And in terms of the issues impacting racialized women, where does one begin? Because it is no different from the rest of the general society, where we know that racialized women, immigrant women, women of color, but the whole gamut of all the intersecting realities women live in, those intersections actually represent power. So let's really be clear about that. There is a stratified power structure that we are living in society, and it is no different in the not-for-profit sector. So as someone who has grown up in the not-for-profit sector, right, in several organizations, I have experienced this personally. Despite my seeming success in terms of being a CEO of 2 national women's organizations, it hasn't been an easy journey. And I know that my own identity, racial and gender, has played key roles in some of the challenges that I've faced over the years. One of the things that we face is the presumptions and assumptions that come with how we look and how we present, that are no different from how the general society would see us. And quite frankly, I would expect that within the not-for-profit sector, I wouldn't have to face that. I would also expect that among my sisters, I wouldn't have to face that.
Well, I was just going to say that,
right?
And I'll just say it naively, but I would have thought in this sector, with the work that is done and the type of research that is done, that it wouldn't be perhaps as bad as in other sectors, but you're saying it's just as bad.
I'm saying it's just as bad, and no matter how high I rise, it doesn't go away. You know, so I am still expected to justify my role and how I got here. And I'm still expected to not, okay, so let me just say plain. Please don't ask me or comment on my articulation anymore. Right? Like, I'm just done with that, and it's tiresome, and don't comment on how articulate I am. And I am articulate. But I just don't need to hear it, because there's an assumption that, that you're pleasantly surprised at how articulate I am, right? And it's not good. And I know some folks think they're complimenting, but you're not. Because I would like for us to be able to break down why you think you need to compliment my articulation, right? So that's just an example of it. Now, I happen to be a very privileged, powerful Black woman because of my salary and because of the position I hold. And so what I go through is not necessarily completely representative of what other women of color experience. And so I'm able to speak truth to power, especially if it challenges me, because I can. But not all people are in a position of privilege and power to be able to do that all the time. And so they have to pick and choose their battles.
Let me read you a quote from the Women's Voices report. It says, quote, "We're not taken seriously by funders because we are an immigrant women's organization. Because we are a women's immigrant organization, we are not seen as part of the, quote, big boys club of immigrant organizations." Faye, does this correspond, or Paulette, with what you've heard within the sector with regard to immigrant women who work in immigrant organizations?
I think that it's very true that the sector is part of the community at large. The patterns of racism, the patterns of prejudice that exist in the society at large also resonate in the nonprofit sector. And when we were preparing for this, we were comparing experiences, and what Paulette has just said about being complimented on her articulateness is absolutely an experience that I've had as well, where I'm frequently complimented on how well I speak English, even though it's the only language I speak. So I'm glad I speak it well, but the assumption that I can't is a bit ridiculous. But it's not just, I mean, those are just those are just the really easy, low-hanging fruit, but it is an issue that runs more deeply in terms of if you are a racialized woman and you're speaking out, you're seen as a troublemaker. You're seen as getting out of line. You're told that you're being confrontational, when what you're just doing is talking about the reality that you experience every day and the women that you are helping experience every day in the course of moving through their lives. So there is a constant disbelief in the reality of that experience. The further that you move from the sort of dominant norms of the dominant class, the less you're believed that that is a reality that needs to be addressed. So, that goes throughout the work that we do, but also in the way that our credentials are recognized, the way in which we're compensated.
On that note, I am going to turn to the idea of solutions. So just bear with us. We'll come to that. But women in nonprofit leadership. There was an interesting Charity Village report from last year that found that the gap between earnings at the chief executive level between women and men and women in the nonprofit sector was 24%, and the disparity is larger at other senior levels. So I'm interested from each of you what your experience has been in terms of, and you talked a little bit about it, Paulette, but maybe you could expand on it. But maybe Sylvia, I'll start with you. And coming into a senior position, how was that, maybe for the benefit of other women in the room who want to get there themselves, how did that journey happen, and what was your experience with it?
Well, I recall my first 3 months I got paid $13,500. But remember, I've been doing this a long time, so even at 10%, you can guess I'm in the Power Club now. You know, we've taken a long view, and I think, I hope it's a lesson for everyone. I read the report, the sort of disparities internal to nonprofits that women feel who are doing frontline work versus how women who have leadership positions are dealt with. And, you know, we're often, many of us, motivated by guilt, and so we have a tendency.
What do you mean by motivated by guilt?
Well, you know, you don't want to make sort of way more than other people, and if you do, you feel badly about that.
Yeah,
and if they
I
find
understand
out,
that.
you feel even worse. So it's. We refer to it as a crab syndrome. Nobody gets out of the bucket without us. So
I hadn't heard that one, but that's good.
yeah. So the issue then is when you're in leadership is to be strategic about that, and it is a challenge for you in nonprofits. I think there should be a stronger emphasis on people-centric than sometimes I see. So you get into mission-centric, and you forget that the people who are working for you and working on weekends and out of hours and that also are people. and so I think from a leadership level, you have to do that. And the other thing is, if we don't value ourselves, nobody's going to value us. And so, you know, the direct people we have in our office, you know, people, you hear all the stories all the time. We were talking, my colleague and I, at lunch about, you know, the guys say, well, you know, you discriminate against guys. And honestly, there's a part of me that wants to say finally, but, you know, employment standards say I can't say that, so I just use my inside voice. And, but if you treat, you know, when you can do things, and if you can't do things, then make strategic priorities about taking care of the people who are taking care of the people. It just seems to do that. And you've got to set scales and set targets and do things that sort of get you there. I hope, I heard one of our staff members who's here today use the phrase that, you know, I don't need more money, I need more holidays. And I was going to do a little math for about how many holidays we give, but it's, there are things you can do, and I think we have to be creative. I think that we reflect a structure of nonprofits that's incredibly patriarchal and hierarchical. And I think those are things that the Crown shared with people and they brought. And I think that we have to dismantle a little bit about how we do that too.
New ways of governance, and yeah, it's interesting. Now, you've talked, in a conversation we had before, you talked about mentoring. How important is that within the Federation, but also more globally within Indigenous women's organizations?
I mean, I think it's one of our most important challenges. You know, we're talking about over 40% of our population under the age of 21 now. So, you know, well, you're all not having babies. Our babies are having babies. And we changed our board structure so that 25% of our board are young people between 18 and 24 years of age. They're elected along with everybody else, but they have to be that. They can run for any office, and they do. And you know, we have non-Indigenous people who work with us, and we give them a mentor when they start, because they're going to be lost in our cultural norms if we don't help them. We, part of the mentoring, I think, is people call or, you know, reach out and say, who do you know who can do this? And when you've been around a long time, you know a lot of people. Increasingly, your people who are at junior levels in government are deputies now, and they've known you a long time. You're a known commodity. You have to create space for people, too. You have to say, you can't just talk to us. You need to bring, the Native women, the Métis women, whoever. You've got, that's part of a mentoring process. So it's not just, sitting and taking time to have tea and talk with somebody. That would be great. But we're already busy. We don't have time. So for me, I try to find the people who can mentor them and try to create the space for them. And I look at the bigger picture things so they can come along. And we're happy to have our 22-year-old, last year, our vice president was 22 years old. We sent her alone to a federal, provincial, territorial meeting of ministers on women's issues because we had a whole bunch of places to go. And she said, well, I don't know what to do. We said, well, you're an Indigenous woman. You know exactly what to do. Go in there with all your tats and speak loud and do whatever you want to do. There's no going back. And it doesn't matter. And she arrives and the minister has her play a weird form of a dating game as introductions, and she felt right at home, she said. So, so just part of what I think we've learned in nonprofits is when we started, we had this desire, we had this kitchen table on the streets mentality. And, we got mortgages and, car payments and
life.
And yeah, and now we're afraid. I wasn't afraid when I was young. We had nothing. I couldn't lose nothing. They gave it to me because I couldn't screw it up. There was nothing there. Now I understand, even talking to you, somebody's going to be pissed off and I'm going to have screwed it up. But I don't care anymore. I'm carefree. Go ahead. I'm looking at going out the door and you're going to call me to be a consultant because every once in a while I will have tweaked your imagination. It's easy.
You want me to follow that, right?
Part of something that Sylvia was saying, I think, relates to networks. And for either Paulette or Faye, sometimes women are not the best self-advocates, or they might not always know how to insert themselves into male-dominated networks, especially when we're talking about leadership positions and so on. Paulette, you have an institute, though, that you've been working with on training women. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe both of you could talk about what advice that you would give to women that want to go up the ladder within their organizations?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to chat. Actually, a former colleague of mine is here who could speak much better to it than I could. But one of the things that the Canadian Women's Foundation recognized several years ago was the importance of leadership transition succession planning. Mm-hmm. And that in our sector, for a number of reasons that we don't have time to go into, folks sort of stay in their roles a long time, mm-hmm. right? And so, but when they move on, there is such leadership disruption that it's not good for the health of an organization. And there's some of us here who would bow our heads to knowing what I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Me probably as well. So, so we started a Women's Leadership Institute in partnership with the Cody Institute at Xavier University. And that program was designed to intake 25 women for the period of a year and put them through significant transformational leadership journey that would have them prepared to take on leadership roles either within their organization or externally. And so we've been able to graduate about over 70 women from that program. And we are currently in the state of trying to reimagine what that could look like, because the current structure, it's quite an expensive endeavor. And so getting corporate partners to step up and say, yes, we want to work with you on this has been challenging, but we are reimagining what that could look like within the sector as well. And so we think we need more opportunities like that, but we see ourselves as the foundation as an important not just supporter, but instigator for what we think is healthy for the sector. So whether you're dealing with governance or leadership or any aspect of that, it's important. But I also want to add another point as well, which is which are millennials that are seeking or see the sector as a place for them to come to work. And when they get there, they're quite disappointed because there are certain things that are not in place for them. When they think about their future, when they think about their mobility, when they think about the kinds of roles they'd like to play. And I take time to speak to millennials quite a bit because they ask, but because I think it's important to understand what drives them and what they're passionate about, but also encourage them to stay within the sector.
So, sorry, can you be more specific about what you think, what are they looking for? Is it like pay and benefits or
Yes.
advancement?
Yeah, they want to be able to make a living in the sector. They want to be able to eventually buy a home. They want to be able to raise a family. They want to live. And we don't pay that well in our sector. Let's just be honest and clear about that. We don't pay that well. We don't pay enough of a living wage in a city like Toronto or other parts of Ontario to actually encourage them to stay. So I think that we need to find ways. I love what ONN just did in terms of the pension plan, which I think is a huge step forward. I know that there's another company that's working towards a different kind of RSP plan as well, to give some options to the sector. But I think preparing and having our sector be a choice for millennials is important, and having them stay because the health and welfare and future of the sector depends on it.
I want to address some of what you raised earlier, and I agree with what Sylvia and Paulette are saying. But you started this discussion about how it's assumed that women don't ask for what they deserve, right? And that's in fact false. That women actually ask for raises as often as men. They ask for as large wages as men do, but they're told no. And so the issue is the way in which that devaluing of women's work, because women are doing it, infuses this sector as well as others, right? And we've spoken a lot about how that's reflected at the leadership level. But one of the other things that really comes out very strongly in the Women's Voices report is the precarity of work throughout the workforce in the nonprofit sector. The fact that the vast majority of work is not permanent full-time, that the vast majority of people do not have benefits. And that is part of this bigger structure that is in part driven by low government funding in the sector, but also this mentality of doing more with less, which is something that the sector is told repeatedly to do. But that it creates a situation where the only way that you can make ends meet is by creating more and more precarious work, which makes it even more difficult for people to stay in the sector and to have decent lives while they're in the sector. And I think that's a very important thing to look at right now, when in Ontario we have a provincial government that is proudly announcing that it's going to repeal Bill 148, which was the once-in-a-generation review of labor standards and labor rights in the province, employment standards, just to give people a bit of a boost where people actually do, as a minimum, have some basic rights to minimum wage, to paid sick days, to emergency leave, to vacation time. And so when we think about those sort of pressures that drive the sector towards precarious work, we have to confront that as something that does it actually accord with the ethos of the sector? I think not. And we can't allow these sort of legislative moments of bullying, of of people who are workers to succeed. This is really a moment for everyone in the sector to stand up and be counted and say, we stand for decent work. Everyone should have the right to decent work and decent lives. That's what we do in our careers. We want it for the people in our sector.
Yes, I think it's worth applauding for. And I mean, I think you heard from speakers earlier today, but if we look at the trajectory of the future of work, it's not like any of these things are going to get any better in terms of the disparities and inequalities.
Well, things won't
income
get better
inequalities.
unless things will continue in this way of erosion if we let them. But that's not inevitable. That's a choice that we're making as a society. And if we don't stand up and lend our voices to a better vision and to expect more, we can expect more, then we're going to get what's coming. But it's not inevitable. And we have power to shift that. What I think is also very important to recognize is that this is the growth sector of the economy. Care work is the single largest growing area of work in our economy other than retail. And so, we want that to be a foundation for decent work because it's going to have an influence on the quality of life for everyone.
So I'll ask a big overarching question, which is about perceptions of the sector, which we started off talking about the care penalty and the idea of that you should, a lot of people are working for free or should be working for minimum. So how do you change that at a broader scale, change that perception? This is a big question, but are there any concrete things that could be done? I don't know whether it's on a communications level or political advocacy level, or Sylvia, I'll start with you. Are there any solutions in that area?
So, yes. I'll hurry this up and tell you a very, very short story. I think that nonprofits have relied on external people to tell their story too long. And so I think that research should be done by you, on you, by your experts, not anybody else's. Sorry, Academy, I mean you too. I think that the policy work, that all of you should be doing policy work. That affiliations, like we have with ONN, we comment on everything ONN does pretty well, and we send it over here as part of a repository. You have to start doing that for yourselves. You have to find ways for information to engage people. It took us a long time to get our membership to spend all of their benefits. They didn't understand why, they didn't understand what for. They were community people with lived experience, and we had to do training and educate them. And I think you have to do that. And don't drag them to a 2-day you have to come orientation. Ease it into them over a period of time. Strongest force on the earth is a single drip of water that's steady. I think that we don't like this, but the issues of looking at business plans are important. The organization I work for is on its second 20-year long-range strategic plans. And we have safety mechanisms so that somebody gets elected and is all mad and wants to change everything. We don't know what we're doing tomorrow. That we're methodical, that we move forward. We have it. So this is my bit of advice to you. I went home at Thanksgiving, my first year of university. My grandparents had, when they've gone on to the spirit world, had 62 grandchildren. I'm the first to go to university. And I wanted to impress on the old woman kind of where I was at and what we were doing. So first we had a conversation about women's rights, and she wanted to know, what was the notion of equality. And I said to be like men. And she said, why would they want to lower themselves? But when I really understood what I had to do and how I approached my work I was talking to her about the notion of strategic planning. And I asked her, because she'd never gone to residential school, she didn't read and write, do you understand what I'm talking about? She said, yes. What you're doing, you make it like a star. and you rub it. She had her apron on, and you shine it, and you place it way up in the sky. And then you turn to your people and you say, that's where we're going. So let's do it. Let's go.
Thank you. Paulette.
Again,
I keep making you follow up from Sylvia.
you know, I love you, Sylvia. So I agree with all of that. That's what I need to say. I agree with all of that. And I think the way to do it, the only way we're going to succeed is to do it intersectionally, right? So to make sure that when we're working in this sector, that all of us are represented. And so I'd like to complete my statement by reading another statement, because Sojourner Truth is one of the women I look to, I think, who actually began the conversation of intersectionality. When she, during the push for women's vote during the suffragette movement in the US, said, "Ain't I also a woman?" Right? And so Ms. Crenshaw, who actually is the person who first used the word intersectionality, says, "Sometimes it feels like those in power frame themselves as being tremendously disempowered by critique. A critique of one's voice isn't taking it away." And I would add that it's actually adding to the power of that voice. So I think it's important that we critique ourselves and allow critique into this sector, into the movements that we're a part of. And then I would add to what Sylvia said earlier, is that we must also use advocacy as a tool. In the previous understanding of advocacy, we could only do 10%. Most of us weren't even doing 2%. So now with CWP's sacrifice, we can do much more, and who knows where this will end up when the federal government brings it back to court. However, advocacy is a critical tool. In fact, it is the only thing that's really helped us to be where we are today, but we've got a little bit comfortable, right? So let's continue to use advocacy to push to not just get what we want, but sustain what we've got. It's really important, especially in this new political reality we're living in Ontario. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I've got 2 different comments that I'd look to when we think about moving ahead. And Sylvia, I love that image of the star, because that's what we should be looking to. That when I say expect more, think of that as exactly it. What is the vision of what we want? And we have to imagine it and say it in order to make it real. And as a sector, there's an enormous amount of power in this sector. There's 1 million people working in this sector. That is a significant voice that you need to draw on as a power base. That this is, I don't know what the math is, but compare it to other industries in the province that are taken more seriously. There's a lot of people here, and you need to flex that muscle. I think that one of the things that contributes to the nonprofit sector being undervalued and under-recognized and not being treated as part of the real economy is that it's called the nonprofit sector. And in a political economy that worships profit, that is a way to say, well, you're not really part of us, right, of the real economy. But the reality is that you don't skim profit for yourselves. What you do is take all your resources and invest them in people and services. And that is a really significant ethos that needs to be brought into our political economy, where we have this worship of profit that's driven the enormous income inequality, that's driven the precarious work that we see in the sector, that continues to drive and leverage those different prejudices that we have in society and say, you can't be working on that principle of privatizing more gain for individuals. We need to be working on a model that invests in people, that drives money into people and services, like the nonprofit sector does. And I think that's a very powerful way to turn away from greed to a vision of community wealth and community building.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that's a great way to wrap up. Faye, thank you very much. Paulette, thank you. Sylvia, thank you. And thank you to all of you. Thanks.